Now let's introduce the floating point types in C++. Again, just to orient ourselves, we're discussing the fundamental types in C++. Among these fundamental types are the floating point types. With the floating point types, we have three different fundamental types that are used to represent floating point numbers. A floating point number can be thought of as a fraction or as a number with digits appearing after the decimal point. The three floating point types in C++ are float, double, and long double. All floating point types, by the way, are signed. Now, the actual sizes of float, double, and long double are implementation defined. In other words, they can vary from compiler to compiler. The only real guarantee is that a double will be at least as big as a float, and a long double is at least as long as a double. And we can declare variables of these types just as you'd expect. So for a float, we would say float and then the variable name. For a double, we'd just say double and the variable name. And you guessed it, right? For a long double, we'd say long double and the variable name. Now, if you want to supply a floating point literal, it's interpreted by default as a double. So, for example, if I were to come up here to the float variable named course heading and just supply one, this would initially be interpreted as a double, as you can see here in Visual Studio. So instead, if I want to specifically denote a literal float, what I need to do is append an F to that value. Now you can use lowercase or uppercase. I tend to use uppercase for these things just because it's a little bit easier to read. And similarly, to denote a literal long double, so for example, if I just supply some value here, again, remember, by default, a floating point type literal is going to be interpreted as a double, but I want a long double here. So in this case, I need to append the character L. Now in this case, while technically you could use a lowercase l, that's just a really bad idea, right? You can see how confusing that could be, how much that looks like a 1. So in this case, it's almost more than just a matter of preference. It's a strong, strong recommendation that you should use a capital letter. Now, as I said, since floating point literals are interpreted as doubles by default, if I wanted to supply an initial value for this knots variable, I don't have to worry about appending a letter or anything like that. I can just supply the value. One last point here. Notice when we hover the cursor over these values, Visual Studio gives us a nice reminder of what we should keep in mind all the time, that floating point values are really just approximations of real numbers, and we need to be aware of the possibility of precision-related or representational errors here. So notice how this is actually, Visual Studio is showing this to me as 795.70000000455, right? So again, in C++, in terms of floating point types, you have float, double, and long double. And you can use any one of these depending on your preferences for possible ranges of values. Just keep in mind that the actual ranges can vary depending on your implementation, and that the only guarantee is that a double is at least as big as a float and a long double is at least as long as a double.